Hey, good day, A-Push. This is Mr. Lang here with another video about World War II. We're going to try to finish up this war so we can start reviewing for the AP exam. It was just announced yesterday that the exam will be a DBQ. So we're going to focus on finishing up period 7 so we can start reviewing for that DBQ. Now, the last video we made was over economics. We will cover politics of World War II in another video. Today I want to focus on social aspects of World War II. Since the exam will be a DBQ, it's going to be very important to keep in mind these historical themes, political, social, and economic concepts. So here we go. The context to keep in mind here, we covered a lot more of it in the other videos on World War II, but just to specifically go after some social context here. The wartime period for America technically is going to start in 1942. That's when a lot of the mobilization efforts are going to get started. So what is the society generally like in America at this time period? Well, there's a lot of volunteerism going around as an idea. Volunteering either to be a soldier without being drafted, or volunteering to do your part. That is a huge aspect of society. The country is seemingly coming together in defense of all that is good, to fight against all that is evil. Victory bonds, we covered in the last video. That's a huge effort. There's a big push for people to start taking what cash they have, despite the fact that depression is still going on, and give it to the government for the war effort. Rationing will be a huge aspect of society here, not only as a continuation of the Great Depression itself, but also as part of the war effort. The less you use, the more the military has to combat evil with. And of course, the draft is in effect. That is something that you cannot overlook in any essay. It has economic, social, and political aspects to it. Now, in 1941, FDR is going to give a speech outlining to the United States what World War II is really going to be about. And he outlines 4 freedoms that define the United States. He outlines the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These are the 4 freedoms FDR is going to outline that define what America is and what we will be fighting to protect. Something else that's important to keep in mind here is the Office of War Information is established in 1942. As you can tell from these images, its job is propaganda. Convince people in America that the war is just, that the war is right, and to convince them of certain wartime measures they need to put into effect and practice in their own lives to help win the war for the good guys. So how does the war impact different groups of American society? A big group to focus on here in your essays, if it does go over World War II, is how the war impacts African Americans. Okay, we're going to have something called the Double V campaign, double victory. Victory at home and victory abroad. So defeating the enemy overseas, defeating evil overseas, while at the same time keeping an eye towards ending Jim Crow and ending racism at home. This is going to be a unifying force for many African Americans who are asking themselves the question, why would I fight and die for a country that does not allow me to vote, that tolerates the Klan running around? These are valid questions that are going to hang around in the United States for a couple decades after this war. So the Double V campaign is crucially important. We're going to have the March on Washington, where a lot of African Americans are going to demand New Deal aspects from FDR. The war effort, in effect, is going to allow him the political leeway to get away, as a Democrat with Southern support, to get away with supporting African Americans, offering jobs, desegregating employment opportunities in the federal government. It's also important to keep in mind here we have the Tuskegee Airmen. This is going to be a major step in the right direction for desegregation of the military. We're going to have a group of African-American fighter pilots. There were some volunteer forces in World War I, but this is going to be an official part of the military, so small baby steps in the right direction here. Remember, during the Great Depression and the New Deal, many Mexican Americans were deported, or as it was called back then, repatriated. So in the 1940s, when people are drafted to war, we're going to sign an agreement with Mexico that we will call over here the Bracero program, which is where we are going to have lots of migrant workers come across the border for harvesting and working in the fields to sort of replace the farmers that were drafted or enlisted in the war effort. This will have long-term effects. One of the consequences that's more immediate are the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1942. A Zoot Suit was a type of outfit worn by many Mexican-American and Hispanic-American citizens and youth. During this time of increased rationing for the war effort, it was seen as unpatriotic or more of a sign of gang activity or hoodlum activity, which led to overt racial attacks in the city of Los Angeles in 1942. But this is something that we can use to show the racial attitudes of the time period even during the war. So it's not just motivated by racism, it's motivated by wartime patriotism as well here. For Asian Americans, this is another dark period in U.S. history, particularly for Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor, they are seen as potential spies or as enemies. With Executive Order 9066, FDR interns in internment camps on the West Coast. They are forcibly removed from their homes and separated into different prison camps run by the military. In 1944, there's even a Supreme Court case where the executive order and the internment of Japanese Americans is upheld. In the American territory of the Philippines, several soldiers are going to be drafted and volunteer. Unfortunately, despite the heroics of their efforts, it will take decades for them to be recognized for their service, which is, again, another dark stain on U.S. history. Native Americans. Perhaps the most famous here is going to be the group called the Navajo Code Talkers, who will use aspects of their own native language in writing and transmitting information through code for the Americans and the Allies more generally. This is coming again on a larger trend of more respect for Native Americans since being forced to assimilate through the Dawes Act in the 1800s. In the 1920s, of course, Calvin Coolidge will grant citizenship to Native Americans. FDR in the 1930s will even have a Native American New Deal where the tribal organizations are reinstated. And in World War II, this trend continues with enough respect for them to enlist. Women, of course, obviously going to have Rosie the Riveter. When the men leave for the jobs, the women, just like in World War I, will come and take their place, keeping production up high, earning themselves more social respect for that as well. What might also be important to know for the DBQ is the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, where women are actually given jobs in the military if they wanted to enlist. There were some jobs available as actual combat, a lot in offices of organizing the war effort. So another step in the right direction here for different groups in society. Key characteristics to keep in mind for the United States at this time period: there is temporary solidarity at home. Yes, we have the internment of Japanese Americans, but we are seeing steps in the right direction in terms of gender and racial equality. So we are starting to see the barriers of Jim Crow being broken down, or at least tested a little bit. Contrast that with the racism we see towards not only Japanese Americans, but much like in World War I, all of our enemies. So anti-German, anti-Italian, anti-Japanese hysteria is running amok, particularly for Japanese Americans, may or may not have led to later events in World War II history. Okay, let's get to some change and continuity over time, since this is going to be a DBQ question. If you were to compare World War II to World War I overall, there are several similarities and differences here. Wilson, much like FDR, is going to expand the powers of the federal government in fighting for a war that they both are going to define as for preserving or expanding democracy. Both presidents, by the end of these wars, are going to push for world peace organizations, the League of Nations in World War I and the United Nations in World War II. Compared with the New Deal, which is FDR again here, we're going to see that despite the New Deal not quite having the results that FDR wanted and making him several enemies, both from the left and the right, the war is going to be more unifying. It's going to allow him to be elected 2 more times for an unprecedented 4 terms as president, or at least being elected to 4 terms as president. As you can see here from this cartoon, this New Deal cartoon, criticizing his grab for power from Congress. This is not going to be an attitude that's widely held during the war effort. It's very much going to be get the job done, let the government do what it needs to do. So very different attitudes here compared to the New Deal. The legacy of this war is very important. You won't have to go beyond 1945 on this year's exam, but it is important to know the impact this war has played on America to this day. Perhaps most notably is in popular culture, with icons such as Captain America coming from this war as a propaganda effort. The film A League of Their Own, about the true events of women filling the role of men in not only the workforce, but in professional baseball. Red Tails is, of course, a film about the Tuskegee Airmen. And, of course, Indiana Jones, at least in the first three movies, is going to be the arch nemesis of several Nazis. So, World War II, very important war here. We're also going to see the roots of several later movements: feminism, the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement. These are all going to have impacts that are really going to get their start here in World War II. Yes, these are trends that have been much larger in history, dating back to at least the 1800s, but in World War II, we're going to see the ball start rolling for a lot of these later movements. It's also going to be the good war, right? World War I often gets looked back on as a war that had no point to it. America did not join the League of Nations. World War II eventually happened, so the war to end all wars did not end all wars. But this one typically is looked at as a clearly defined line between good and evil. And the very important lesson here for several politicians afterwards is that in times of great crises, the government can and should do what is necessary. Now, that is an overriding opinion. We see it time and time again here during the Cold War, which immediately follows World War II. This will be expanded upon during economic downturns. Oftentimes, people will seek emergency powers and expansion of government's role. And oftentimes today, we hear the climate change issue be presented as this generation's version of the existential crisis that the Axis powers represented. So, war mobilization dialogue is very important here. Typically, if you want something done now, these days, after World War II, you're going to declare a war on something. LBJ is going to declare a war on poverty, for example. The conservatives in the 70s and 80s are going to declare a war on drugs. So the framing of good wars comes to us from this war. And of course, at the end of the war, most of the technology that we're going to see be invented for the war effort will be converted into aspects for 1950s consumerism. Okay, lots of new radio technologies. Computers will eventually come from this, rockets and jet engines. So consumerism is the next step in American social development following this war. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. Stay tuned for the political video so we can wrap this up. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, leave a comment down below, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at Mr. Lang History. I will see you next time. Have a good one. Wash your hands.